Hi guys, my name's Owen Claxton. I'm one of two audio engineers working out of Top Floor Audio Works in Sheffield. I'm also the man behind the faders for Coffin. So I worked on their first EP, and I've also just finished working on their upcoming EP, New Soul Mighty, which is due for release in November, I believe. Basically, I'm going to take a bit of time today to nerd out about some of the production. I'm going to do a little bit of a breakdown of my approach to mixing and mastering their songs. I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual sessions themselves, some of the gear that we used, how we tracked the project, all the steps that we took to actually get to the end point. Before we dig into it, I just want to say, if at all you like what you hear today and you'd like to reach out to me, you'd like me on your projects, that'd be massively appreciated. You can find me on Instagram on my personal account, which is Owen Claxton 94. You can find our studio on Instagram at Top Floor Audio Works, all one word, or you can get to us via Gmail at topfloorAudioworks@gmail.com. If you just pop a little message on there asking for me, I'll make sure to get back to you as soon as possible. But without any other hesitation, let's get into it.
Hey guys, so here we have it. This is the original project for Coffin's Welcome to Rot. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk through a few of the mixing and mastering choices I made, a few of the production choices that we all collectively made, and talk a little bit about the tracking process as well. So for anyone that is interested in the more nerdy side of things, this is probably for you. One thing I will say is if you look at the project, it's not particularly dense, including buses. We're on like 54 tracks. It's not a huge amount. It's worth saying I've got some hidden DIs and stuff as well there. Basically, I think the theory with the guys in Coffin is they're about keeping things minimal. They're a three-piece. They want to be able to recreate what they do live, but the idea is each individual element needs to sound like a house falling down. So I think we've done a pretty good job of capturing that. What I'll do to kick us off is I'll play a little bit of the chorus before I start diving in and talking about things. Cool. So that's just a bit of the chorus there. I'll start at the top in terms of how I work through the project. So not just this one. So the kind of mix that you're going to see me sort of talking about today is pretty much being standard for the whole of the new EP, New Soul Mighty, which is out in November. And it's a similar setup to the way I kind of did the last EP as well, Flat Cap. My whole approach to mixing and mastering is something that I think is kind of getting a bit more popular these days, which is top-down mixing. So what that essentially means for anyone who's not familiar is I don't have a great deal happening on the individual tracks within a project. Not a great deal of plugins. Not a lot happening there. What I tend to do is I start at the top of a project, and when I say top, I mean the sort of back end of it, I suppose, is the way to put it. I'll start with the master output, so that's what everything's going through, and I'll work from there to build the overall sound, and then I'll go into the individual channels and work on any problems or things that I think need changing at that level secondarily. So I'll not spend a huge amount of time talking about what every single one of these plugins is doing. I'll briefly go through it for those who are interested. So the key thing for me, if I open up these first two, is the sound that Swamp Coffin tend to go for is obviously it's doomy, it's horrible, it's heavy. It's a little bit old school as well. I know myself and John, their guitarist and vocalist, both sort of Black Sabbath fans, so we like it to sound a little bit retro in certain areas. And there's obviously the whole like 90s doom influence throughout it as well. So part of the thing that I do to kind of play into that is I run the whole mix through this tape machine emulation. And basically what this is doing is it's just adding, I can't really describe it other than a bit of vibe to the recording. Makes it sound ever so slightly more analog with it being analog modelled. Adds a fair bit of sub, adds a bit of excitement to the record. So this is kind of how it sounds with it A-B'd on and off. Yeah, there we go. So just adds a ton of body and presence and a lot of glue to the recording. Makes everything sound a little more cohesive. As you can see from that clip there, I am absolutely spanking it into the red. With it being analog modelled and working on old school VU, I don't mind hitting the red, that's fine. Other people may disagree, but it works for me. I'm happy with it. Up next, again, these two plugins are, again, just a bit more saturation. I can't remember which this one's modelled off with the RC Tube. But again, analog emulation, just adding a bit more saturation, a bit more warmth. This second one here, I've got it set to the present function. So that's, again, just adding that little bit of top end sizzle, a little bit of clarity to the recording. I'm not adding any drive through this one, although you can. And whatever the intensity is, I've got that set to 32%. Again, doesn't add a huge amount when you A/B it, but it adds something. Yeah, so as you can hear there, they both independently add their own kind of flavour to the record. Next up, really briefly, is my EQ settings. That everything in the mix is passing through this EQ, so it's not too drastic. A lot of people don't like this EQ method, so what I'm essentially doing here, if I take out points 4 and 6, is it's a smiley face EQ curve. A lot of people don't really agree with that nowadays. Some people do. A lot of hip hop, R&B, pop, people love this sort of thing because it gives you all the thump down the bottom end, gives you all the clarity at the top, and it can really finish off a record. I firmly believe that it works, so that's what I go with. So yeah, couple of dB on the bottom, couple of dB on the top with the shelves, just to kind of add some thump, add some presence, add a bit of clarity at the top. And then I've also added in a slight boost at 1K. That's probably because I got partway through mixing and felt that the mids were maybe lacking a bit of aggression, so I've pushed that ever so slightly. And then 0.4 here, I had engaged as well to pull out a little bit of, around about 200 hertz. So that's probably where I've heard a little bit of build up, heard a little bit of boxiness, and thought, you know what, I'll whip that out. So, I mean, this is the kind of A/B with and without the EQ, so you can hear what it actually does. Yeah, so regardless of what you're listening on, I'm currently listening through headphones, but whether it's headphones, monitors, whatever it is, the difference when that is engaged and disengages, it's pretty night and day. You lose a lot of the thump from the kick drum and a lot of the kind of chunk of the bass on the bottom, and also things on the top end aren't quite as clear either, so that's a bit of a must for me in terms of the master EQ. And then next up, I've got 2 rounds of compression going on. So the first one in the chain is this C4 multiband compressor. Really cool tip that I saw, I think it was on a podcast or something. a while back with Greg Wells, the producer, who's probably most famously known for mixing Katy Perry's records and the Greatest Showman soundtrack. So one of his tips made it into Swamp Coffin's recordings. Basically, he was saying every record he works on gets this multi-opto mastering preset thrown on, and then he just messes about with the faders until they kind of compress in a good amount in each sort of frequency range here. I throw it on everything nowadays because it just kind of gives everything a bit of focus, pushes everything forwards, really focuses in on the kind of kick, the bass, snare drum, and the vocals, like everything that's right down the middle of a mix that you want to be punchy and forward. This kind of helps it come forward a little bit. And then this second compressor is set to not really do a lot. It basically only engages when the snare hits, so it knocks like a dB off everything when the snare hits to kind of bed the snare into the rest of the track, but make sure that it can still be heard. And the other thing I'm doing here is there's a little bit of drive on this, and also I'm high passing the side chain of the compression at 64 Hz. So what that means for anyone who isn't familiar, this isn't going to affect what we hear out of the compressor. It just affects what the compressor hears on the way in. So this dial is basically telling the compressor everything below 64 Hz, I don't want you to do anything with it. So that means if the compressor hears a kick drum or bass, it's not going to react. And the good thing about that is I can keep all the punch and all the dynamics of the kind of low end of the track whilst still squishing down the kind of pokey transient stuff at the top, without messing with my low end balance there. So that's kind of what I have going on here. So I'll just play it a little bit with these on and off so you can kind of see the difference that these make. Cool, so that's my kind of master compression. And the last thing I have going on here is a couple of limiters. So this big boy here, the Slate FGX, this isn't currently doing anything. I've turned it off just for the purpose of doing this video, just because I want to make sure the track is level with me speaking. When I finished the project, this was actually up around probably 6 or 7. With the RMS peaking at -7 or -8, which is usually the kind of volume I'll go out for a CD level master. So that's currently doing nothing, but in general, that's my kind of go-to limiter. It's pretty transparent. You can turn things up quite loud without having any sort of detrimental effect. It's pretty hard to get that thing to clip. The inflator is just before it in the chain. So for anyone who isn't familiar with this plugin, I think it technically is a limiter, but it does so much more. It kind of just gives everything a bit of muscle, makes everything a little bit more rounder, a bit more pronounced, a bit fatter. It's great. I mean, the difference with and without it is pretty night and day. It's worth saying as well, I normally have this set a lot louder, maybe minus 0.3 usually. I've just got it set so low today again because I just want to make sure the audio from the song's level with my voice. But that's basically my mastering channel strip that I'll throw on pretty much every project nowadays. To varying degrees, I'll adopt what's going on to make it suit the song, but in general, that's the kind of order of things that I've got going on for the Swamp Coffin sessions anyway. So if I move on a little bit, I suppose the next kind of notable thing that I do with all my mixes is I treat the vocals and all the instrumentation separately. So all these vocals right now, if I click on one, its output is just set to the stereo output, the master bus strip that I was just working through. Whereas anything music-wise is being sent to this all music fader, which is here. The reason I do that is because I often like to add a bunch more EQ and a slightly different level of compression to the instruments that doesn't necessarily work for the vocals, so I'll treat them separately. So in this case, if I solo up all the music right now, what I've basically done here is I have a couple of, 3 analog model EQs and then a bit of a trimmer just taking some volume off at the end of the chain. And what I've essentially done with these first 2 EQs, these API modelled EQs, is I've taken points along the frequency spectrum that I think are flatter into the song and just boosted them by 2 dB. So, for example, on this first strip, I have a 50 Hz sub boost, I have a 400 Hz low mid boost, which is not something that I'd usually do, but I felt like this song needed it. It was a little bit hollow in that area, so I thought a boost there was good. I have a 1.5k boost, which again is more so for the kind of the note definition of the guitars with the tuning that these guys play in. It often lands in that region, and also the snare cuts through quite nicely at that frequency. And then at the top I have a 10k boost, that's kind of for the clarity and air at the top. Similarly on this strip I have a 100 Hz boost, so that's all the kind of, kick punch, bit of bass, and a 5k boost, which I think is, helpful for, again, a bit of snap on drums. It's often quite a nice region on a kind of kick drum and a bass as well. On bass, I like to refer to it as the kind of corn frequency, because it always sounds like the top end kind of jing 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 corn sort of bass tone frequency. So that's those. And then in terms of this third EQ, it's a slightly different sounding EQ. I think a lot of people just ask me why I didn't use another one of these, but these genuinely are very good plugins and they do sound different. So I have a little tiny little bit of 60 Hz going on, just for a bit of kick reinforcement, and a tiny little bit of 12k boost on the top. Again, that'll just be for a bit of shimmer that I probably at the time felt was missing. And if I A/B this is kind of the difference that these EQs make. It's pretty large, basically. There we go. So as you can hear it, they bring an awful lot to the track. The next thing up that all the instruments are going to is this compressor here. So the way that I have this set currently is I do have it on auto release, but it's actually quite a fast release. 2-to-1 ratio, and then I'm bringing the threshold down until I see basically 2 to 3 dB of reduction. Again, I've got the high pass going on like I had on the other compressor, so it's not listening to the kick or the bass or anything like that. And the way that I've got this set at the moment is it basically just clamps down on the track again whenever the snare's coming through, to just kind of help glue everything together a little bit. So this is the kind of effect that this has. There we go. So I found when I was listening there is actually often I convince myself it sounds better without it, because when you turn it off, everything kind of is a little bit louder and everything's a little bit pokier. But I think in the context of a big rock mix these days, compression is pretty key. So I know that for the sake of the end product, it is going to be better off with that engaged. So all my music's going through this bus through those two things. Aside from that, the individual parts and individual tracks do have their own processing. So I think for me, the first place I always start with a mix, and where I'll probably go now, is to talk about the drums a little bit. So essentially, this is how Dave's drums sound on their own. Cool. So before I go into what's going on each track, it's worth noting what I've done with the drums is each individual part, if there are multiple parts. So for example, I have 2 snare mics. This doesn't include triggers and samples, but if anything with a couple of mics, so 2 snare mics goes to a snare bus, 2 overheads goes to an overhead bus, and all the individual channels, all of that stuff is basically going through to this drum bus. So that's what's summing those things all together into one signal. What I have going on this drum bus is basically just an instance of this SSL compressor. So for anyone who isn't familiar, this is, in a lot of people's minds, the kind of go-to for drum compression, well, for compression in general. I have it set to auto release, sort of medium to longish attack. Only a 2-to-1 ratio, I didn't want to go crazy. And then I'm basically just putting this down till I get sort of maybe 3 to 4 dB of compression usually. Yeah, so that thing's awesome. I mean, it just gives the drums a little bit of life. It gives them that pulse. So I have that running on my main drum bus. What I have blended in under there, we'll ignore this reverb for a minute. I also have a parallel compression. So for anyone who's not familiar, quite a common technique with drums is to have your main signal, which for me would be this drums bus that we're just listening to, and secondarily have another signal that's much more, it's the same thing, so same instruments individually, so kick, snare, toms, overheads, rooms, etc. But to compress it far more heavily and layer it under the other one. So one signal gives you all the punch and the poke and the attack. The other signal gives you a more crushed, more sustained version of the same thing, which you can then blend to taste. What I also like to do is I like to distort mine as well. So I have Decapitator running to kind of crush the life out of it a little bit. So this is what the drum parallel sounds like on its own. Yeah, so it sounds a little bit silly on its own, but when you put it in under the other kit, it gives it the kind of bit of life, bit of grit, bit of saturation that the drums need to kind of really sound powerful. There we go, and then the last thing I've got here is a dedicated snare reverb channel, which sounds like this. Sounds a little bit silly on its own. The reason for that is I have a dedicated snare reverb purely because I feel like the snare often benefits from a slightly different reverb to the rest of the kit. And in this instance, what I actually realised was the room at Top Floor Audio Works, where I work, is not the biggest room on earth. And what I've started doing more recently is I've been making a fake room mic, basically. So if I turn this off for a second, this is how my room at the studio actually sounds. So it doesn't sound crazy big. So what I've started doing is basically putting a fake, a reverb plugin on there to make it sound bigger. So that's kind of a room cheat. Then what I'll do is usually compress the life out of it. Although I'm saying that, that's not that compressed compared to where I usually go. I have a tiny little bit of soothe here to pull out some of the nasties. If there are any sort of production folk watching, if you don't have this plugin, get it. It's cut my EQ time and needs in half because it just finds the nasties, pulls them out for you. It's brilliant. And so basically the point I was getting to, was because I have this fake room with a larger sounding room with a reverb already on, I've been finding that the other channels, so the toms, the overheads and stuff, the kick, when you would want a little bit of kick reverb or kick room sound anyway, often don't need a reverb send when I have this room set up the way I do. So hence the reason I only have an additional snare reverb and not a reverb for the toms or the overheads or anything, because they don't need it. The snare just needed a little bit more to get it to kind of crack through. Hence the reason I have a snare reverb in there as well. So you can kind of hear there, even on the kick, that fake room sound is taking care of some of the kick sort of ambience. And similarly, those toms have got plenty of space around them as well. Cool. So while we are here on the subject of looking at drums, one thing I will say is this was basically tracked to a click. Dave is a great drummer, tracked to a click, but not timed. So no quantization, no time editing going on, because it just doesn't work for the feel of the band. So, these guys will sound natural. They want a bit of flow to what they're doing. The nature of the music is very kind of push-pull in terms of timing anyway, so no time editing going. One thing I will say is, I'm pretty open about the fact as well, there are samples, there are triggers going on here. So, for the kick, I have these additional samples here. And the reason for those is basically just to get some of that kind of attack to the top of a kick. I think in this day and age, without getting into the debate around it, everyone uses samples, so I'm just matching up to the market. I want these guys to match up to what other people are doing. I want people to listen to it and be like, those drums sound how I expect drums to sound. And the problem with the modern market is people expect drums to sound processed and sampled, so I'm more than happy to drop them in, basically. So yeah, I'm using them mainly for the attack on the top end of it, because the kick that I've already got is quite chunky and low from the real kick in the room. And I also have an instance of Waves R bass on here, which basically creates a sub-octave under whatever you put it on. So I've got the fundamental of this kick is maybe around 100, 110 hertz. I have a sub-frequency generated at 60 under that, basically. I don't know how much that'll translate depending on what you're listening to. I highly doubt people are listening to this on studio quality monitors. But basically that just adds a little sub underneath everything. I mean, I'll just play it for you with it turned up to see if it translates. Yeah, so that's a crazy excessive amount, but that's just to demonstrate what that plugin actually does. So, because I've got so much sub coming from that real kick, I'm more than happy for the samples to just act as reinforcement for the top end punch. There we go. And then in a similar sense with the snares, again, I'm looking for crack, and the other thing is the that sounded terrible. I'm looking for crack. No, I'm just looking for the crack of the snare. And also I use this second trigger channel more so as an ambience. I think, if I'm right in thinking, this is... Yeah. So I have this thing called tone deaf snare blended in here, which for the intelligent among us, we will realise that is just a Deftones rip-off. But that kind of high, ringy, mental sounding bin lid snare is great for this sort of stuff. So I have a little bit of that blended in there, basically under all the other stuff that's going on, and it kind of it sounds like this basically with all the snares together. Yep, so you can hear that crazy amount of ring on there, but it sounds great in context of the song when you drop it back in. Yeah, sounds great. And like I said, I'm not precious about dropping samples in. Not shy about it either. I think it augments a drum sound. I never completely replace a drum with a sample, but I will throw it in there for layers and to get sounds that we may not be able to get in the room or with the gear that we've got. So that's why they're in there. I think aside from that, nothing else super interesting to talk about with drums. So let's move on to some bass. So the bass for this song, well, the bass for every song on this record anyway, obviously the last record was a different bass player who had a huge setup. So we had a bunch of weird and wonderful kind of options last time around in terms of where we could take our tones from, where we could run signals from and to, in and out of pedal boards, in and out of heads, DIs, the whole shebang. There was everything going on. This time round, it was a lot more straightforward in terms of let's take a DI, let's take a signal, and let's work with it. So the signal bass, so i.e. the thing that's been sent to an amp, in this case hasn't actually been sent to an amp, so it's actually been sent through a Kemper Profiler amp on a dark glass, I can't remember if it was B7K or B3K patch into a Ampeg SVT head. So the amped tone, we'll call it amped tone even though it's not a real amp, sounds like this. It sounds horrendous, so just be ready for it. I should preface that by saying it sounds horrendous, but we wanted it to. That's intentional. Part of what creates the sound that these guys go for is everything sounds gnarly and nasty. So we wanted that kind of ridiculous, over the top, driven kind of top end bass tone. And what I've got to support that underneath it is I've got a DI, which is running through just a basic clean amp sort of preset and guitar rig. And that's creating the kind of fundamental nice bass sound, if you like, just to support under all that gain and keep some sort of note definition. So this is how that sounds. Yeah, so altogether both tones kind of stacked on top of each other sound like this. Now, the amount of gain that's on the top end of that might sound ridiculous on its own, but when you throw it into the mix, obviously it blends and meshes really nicely with what John's got going on with the guitars as well. There we go, so all the chunk of the bottom end of that bass is still there, but then you've still got that rattle, the kind of clangy mid-range that cuts through everything, even in that verse. Hence the reason that huge amount of distortion is really important. In terms of what I've got going on with the bass after the fact, it's not anything spectacular. I have a bit of saturation, a bit of EQ, so on here you can see I'm bringing out super low end, like 80 hertz on the bass. I'm high passing at 46 hertz, so nothing below that's going to come through. Some people may say different, but for me, I don't need anything below that. And then I'm cutting a little bit of kind of the sort of honky lower mids around 200 hertz. Boosting, where am I boosting? 862 hertz, and also around about 3K. So yeah, all that kind of clangy mid range I'm boosting there. And then 1176 compressor, which is I think a favourite for many for bass. Probably knocking off between 3 and 5 dB here, I'd assume. Let's have a look. Yeah, so that's purely just there to control the bass a little bit, knock down some of the bigger transients, bring up some of the less prominent ones. Aside from that, I think I have a little bit of sort of corrective EQ again, so I'm pulling out a couple of nasties at the bottom, boosting a little bit of mid-range, boosting a bit of high mid, chopping off some of the excessive high end because it's probably just noise at that point. And then my favourite trick is this compressor here. So what I've done is basically this compressor isn't listening to what the bass is doing, if that makes sense. I've got this side chain here selected for the kick GGD, which is the kick sample I have here. And what this compressor is doing is it's listening for every time the kick hits and compressing the bass guitar based on what the kick's doing. So what it's doing is if the kick hits, the bass compresses, so that means that the kick can cut through the bass without any conflicting frequencies or conflicting space down the bottom end, basically. So if you watch this meter here, you'll see it duck out every time the kick hits. Or rather this meter here to the left, sorry. So yeah, all that's happening there is basically the bass is just getting out of the way every time that kick hits. It just means that whatever speakers someone's listening on, the speakers can focus on pushing that kick drum out and really hitting you in the chest without it having to kind of fight around the bass frequencies at the same time. So that's it for bass. Next up, guitars. So this is one of the chunkier parts and probably the more detailed things that we went into. I think it's worth saying when we did drums, Dave is a machine, so he gets through them pretty quick. And again, the drum setup wasn't anything too strenuous, you know. It was all tracked at, well, everything was tracked at my studio, Top Floor Audio Works. It's worth saying, actually, while I'm here, in terms of mic selections, we had a AKG D112 on the kick. Just an inside mic, I didn't bother with an outside. What we did do was we built a little, I say tent, it was a couple of sheets around the kick drum just to shield the mic and stop any cymbal bleed getting in there. Both snare top and bottom were SM57s, so that's kind of a pretty prominent choice. I think it's a pretty universally known snare mic. A bit of a workhorse mic as well. It's, you know, the go-to for a lot of people for snare, the go-to for a lot of people for guitars as well. So that was the snare mics. The rack and floor toms were both Sennheiser I can never remember if it's 609 or 906. It's the small square one. Either way, I think it's 609. The overheads were AKG C1000s, I want to say. The pencil condensers. I'm just realising at this point I can't remember mic names. This is terrible. So yeah, AKG C1000s, the long black pencil condensers. And then the room mic on this session was an Aston Origin. Aston Origin. So that was the kind of mic selections there. Obviously, as I said on the bass, no microphones involved. So we had a Kemper profiling amp and a straight DI into the desk. And then guitars is where it gets interesting. So you can see here from a bit of my labelling, I myself am a guitarist. Obviously, John is a phenomenal guitarist and also probably as much of a gear nerd as I am. So we always have a lot of fun trying to figure out how we want to get a tone, how we want to put stuff together. So what we did when we first started tracking, we were basically using a Line 6 Helix, which you can see here. And our initial intention was to use the Helix as a sort of basic tone to take DIs to then later down the line in the sessions reamp them back out to John's rig. And what we actually ended up with from the Helix was a tone that we both really liked. So what we did was we kept the Helix tone on both sides. So there's a left and a right just from the Helix, which sounds like this. It sounds pretty silly on its own, but in the context of the mix, it sounds great. So we were like, okay, Helix tone's good, we'll keep that. The next thing we did was we felt that we needed a bit of bite, a little bit of kind of sizzle. I think I can never remember. I think John refers to this take as the 90s death metal tone, maybe, or something like that. Either way, it's basically one guitar straight up the middle. It's there purely for note definition, so none of the low end chunk, none of that. We just use it to cut through the mix. For this one, we use the Kemper again, PV 5150, or maybe a 6505. It's either a PV 5150 or 6505 patch that we used, and it is all the top end is the best way I can put it. It's there just for sizzle and to cut through the other guitars, basically. So there we go, they were the kind of first three. And then what we did was I threw the DI for these Helix signals back out through John's actual rig as well, just for some extra thickness. And when I did that, that actually ended up being my favourite tone of the three. A little but of outboard EQ on these as well. So on the way back into the interface, these came through a I can't remember the name of the company who makes it, but it's basically a Neve 1073 clone, and I did a bunch of EQ on the way in on these, so this is how they sound. There we go. So basically what I kind of did with these is, you know, I used the Helixes for a bit of chunk, the Kemper to kind of cut through and give you all the note definition, and then these really are the kind of mid-growl main guitar tone, really. So all together they sound like this. And in the context of the mix, yeah, really great. In terms of what I'm doing to those guitars after the actual recording and amp stage, it's worth saying, the reamps were recorded with two Shure SM57s on a Friedman clip, or Fredman clip. So for anyone who isn't familiar, that's basically a mic clip made by a very intelligent man who worked out that if you put two SM57s at a 55-degree angle from each other, they perfectly phase cancel all the high-end crap that you don't want and all the low-end crap that you don't want, and they give you a really nice rounded guitar tone. Hence the reason why there's no post EQ on these or anything, just that little bit of outboard EQ on the way in that I mentioned. All I'm doing after the fact with these guitar tones is I have them running through Soothe, which is on this Guitar D Spike preset, which is a preset made by the producer Adam Nolly Getgood. The man's a genius. All this really does is it takes some of the nasty frequencies out of the guitar, basically, and you'll see here there's a hell of a lot of them, but they're very small. Yeah, so most of what's been removed there is all kind of fizzy nonsense. Next up, I have a EQ here, which is kind of what I generally go for across the board with the guitars. So low end roll off, I'm not interested in anything below 100 Hz usually. Top end, where am I at? 7.5K. Yeah, so again, not interested in the top end. A lot of it's just fizzy nonsense, especially when you've got guitars as gainy as what we're working with. I have added a bit of a resonant bump just over 8K on what I call the boob frequency. And then I've just pulled out a few nasty spots along the kind of frequency spectrum. So this will be kind of the low end crud that we don't want to hear. Probably a bit of sort of mid-range honk. And then a couple of nasties in the higher mid-range that are probably just poke you in the ears a little bit, so I wanted to get rid of them. And it looks like I've boosted just a little bit of, central mid-range, if you want to call it that. Probably because I just felt there was a bit of body lacking in the guitars, I would assume. There we go. So they're not entirely huge moves, but they're just getting everything to kind of sit in there nicely in terms of all these guitar layers forming one kind of larger sound. The last thing I've got going on with the guitars is pretty similar to what I had going on with the bass. So on the bass bus, I had this compressor that was listening to the kick and ducking the bass every time the kick hit. On the guitars, I have the same thing, but this is listening to the snare. So every time the snare hits, the guitars duck ever so slightly, just so the punch of the drums is really cutting through and none of these additional factors are getting in the way. So as you can see, it's the tiniest little bit, but it just helps the speakers push that snare through without the guitars getting in the way quite so often. And then at this point, it's worth saying we have a couple of, once we get past that main stack of guitars, we have a few little additional bits that are bits that we'll have layered in. So what we have here is a feedback channel, and I can't remember for the life of me whether or not this is tracked through an amp or it was just feedback that we somehow managed to capture from the Helix through the studio monitors. I think it's just through studio monitors, which is pretty impressive. And then I've basically just mangled it a bit with a bit of micro shift, which for anyone who isn't familiar, this is just essentially a doubling plugin. So what it does is it duplicates the signal left and right through the speakers, tunes one of them slightly sharp, tunes one signal slightly flat, so you get a weird chorusy sound. And I've popped a bit of echo on there too. Yeah, so the differential here there, if I play this bit, this is with it turned off. It's very much down the middle of the kind of stereo field. So if you're wearing headphones, you'll notice it sounds like it's right in between your eyes. If you listen on monitors, it'll seem like it's straight in front of you. But then if I throw this back on, this will push it out to the sides and it'll start sounding a little bit chorusy and detuned. There we go, and that just kind of sits in between the... So this verse has got these kind of really chaotic fills where the whole band plays together, and then the gaps in between are kind of bass driving the section with John ringing out the feedback on guitars, and then Dave, I think he's just on the kick drum at those points. Yeah, so just the kick drum in these sections, in these gaps, and the feedback just kind of fills that space here. Cool. And then further on into the song, what we've got here, I believe this is some clean guitar. Yeah, listening now, I'm talking from memory with a lot of this stuff because I haven't really opened the session since we finished mixing and mastering it. But I'd hesitate to call that a clean guitar, but it's about as clean as Swamp Coffin will get. And then here we have this really cool second clean guitar, which is really quite quiet in the mix, but it adds a lot. I'll solo it up so you can hear exactly what it's doing. And then these three guitars here are just a bit of a riser, so they're all basically just building into the next section, just a dun 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 dun. But if I remember right, they're all slightly different notes, and they're all slightly minging on their own as well. Yeah, so they don't necessarily sound pleasant, but in context they sound brilliant. They help everything build up really well. And again, these clean guitars are basically going through the same processing that the other guitars were above. They're all running to this guitar bus with the same three plugins going on. Some of these have got their own kind of bits and bobs of EQ going on just to get them to sit into the mix a bit better. This one in particular has got a healthy amount of delay and a bit of reverb, its own reverb. So often I will send things to a reverb bus if I choose that it's going to have reverb on it. That's usually when I'm grouping stuff together. If I've got a really specific effect reverb in mind, I'll just pop it on the channel, which is what I've done here. Without those effects, this is how that take sounds. And then with. So it's extremely subtle. It's more so just giving that a little bit of space in the background. And then the last thing I've got for guitars here is just these little fill sections. And these are again through the Kemper 5150 tone. And we've basically used these just to fill out the gaps in the next riff, just to reinforce some of the little trills that are in there. There we go. So that is it for the guitars. I think the next thing, and probably final thing actually to jump onto, is the vocals, which, as we mentioned earlier, I've clearly labelled very clearly. Across the whole EP, both the new one that's due to be released and the previous one, what we'll often do with John's vocals is we'll separate them basically into three ranges, I suppose. So we have a mid-range, which is what I'd call John's normal scream. That's kind of his comfortable level to be at. We'll then usually layer on certain parts like choruses or particularly heavy bits or whatever. We'll layer a guttural sort of low octave underneath it just to thicken things up. And then the last thing that we occasionally do as well is a high, I don't know how to describe it, high death metal, cradle of filth, nasty vocal that's sometimes in there as well. And again, we generally use that on the bits that just need to poke through. So, starting from the top down, this is how John's lead vocal normally sounds.
Touch him, pull through, welcome to run, all the poison in you, welcome to run, cast down, shoot them.
Okay, so that's, as I say, that's what I'd call the mid and the mid-range vocal, which is John's kind of natural level. I'm not doing a hell of a lot of crazy stuff with these vocals. Basically what I've got going on here is 2 preamp channel strips, both doing healthy amounts of saturation. Obviously with the screamy type vocals that John's doing, I want it to be distorted and horrible. So again, not sure which strip this first black one's emulating, but the second one's a kind of Neve emulation. And I'm pushing that to the point of analog distortion anyway, albeit fake. But yeah, heavy amount of distortion coming through these basically. And then next up, just a bit of EQ. So boosting a little bit of top end, some definition, bit of kind of 1.5 kilohertz just for that sort of spitty, nasty mid-range to come through from his shouts. I'm cutting out 400-ish hertz. That's pretty standard for me. I think it gets a little bit boxy with a lot of vocalists in that range. I'm giving a healthy amount of sort of 250 hertz, which isn't very common for me, but I guess with screamy vocals you sometimes need a bit of chest in the bottom of it, so that'll be why I've done that. Next up, LA2A compression. So this is happening basically to catch the peaks and the transients of the scream. So yeah, this will just knock the spikes off. I've got it on the limiting mode rather than compressing, so it's literally there just to even out the vocal as a whole before I drop in this distressor style compressor at the end, which is the one I use more for an effect to get it to sound compressed and crushed. These haven't looked, but these will be doing a heavy amount of lifting for a song like this. So you'll probably see this arrow will dart back a bit, and this light will be way down here probably. Yep, so they're doing some heavy lifting. So next thing in my chain for John's vocals anyway is I've just got Soothe running this clean up a little vocal harshness preset. I forget who makes this one. It doesn't matter. But again, just notching out some of the nasty stuff in there that's a little bit abrasive to listen to. As you can see from the graph, it's really subtle, but it is pulling out some nasties along the way.
Welcome to run all the poison.
There we go. Last thing, similar sort of sense, is the de-esser, just pulling out the S's and the F's and the all that good stuff.
And you, welcome to run, cast down, shoot them, stronger foreign.
There we go. So with sort of aggressive screamy vocals in general, I don't tend to do a lot. As you can see, saturation, EQ, compression, a bit of control, and a bit of kind of subtractive EQ work just to get things to sit where I need them to and not be too abrasive. And then I'm basically sending this out to 2 sets of effects. So I've got a reverb first. Super long, just over 2.5 seconds long. A little bit of pre-delay to keep it out of the way of the immediate vocal. Little bit of width, a little bit of chorus to it. That sounds like this in isolation. Yeah, so again, the idea with that, it sounds cavernous, it sounds large, it puts John's voice in the right space in terms of the track. Makes him sound like he's in a deep, dark cave, which is where their music comes from, deep, dark caves. And then secondly, I have an instance of Echo Boy, which is just doing some 8th note delay. It's not a definitive delay that I'd use as an effect to make something sound delayed. It's more so a sporadic kind of delay that's pretty slappy and just sits there in the background to kind of glue the vocal into the mix. So in isolation, that sounds like this. There we go. So it's like, as I say, it's not super prominent when it's in the song either. It's more so just to get everything glued in together. There we go. So that's the main vocal and how I treat that. The lower vocal has all the same processing, apart from I add this doubler effect to it. So in a similar way that I was describing the microshift earlier, detuning both positively and negatively on each side to kind of widen the sound, this doubler does the exact same thing. And I put it on the low vocals more so because I want those low gutturals to sound like a demon. I want them to sound horrible, I want them to sound evil, and I find that this is a good way to achieve it, basically. So this is how they sound without and then with the doubler effect. Yeah, it sounds terrifying. So as I say, all the other processing, the reverb, the delay, the EQ compression, everything else is all the same. It's just that doubler that I add to the lower ones to try and get them to fill out the space around the lead, but also sound a bit more menacing. So stacked up, they sound like this.
And you, welcome to run, cast down, shoot up, stronger foreign. You never get forgiveness. Welcome to run.
Yeah, mean. Cool. So that's the mid and the low. Let me what I call the Cradle of Filth death metal vocal. So again, super high, kind of the top end of, for screaming anyway, what most people can do. And again, this has also got the doubler on that I just used on the lower vocals as well. All the other processing's exactly the same.
Welcome to run. Welcome to run.
I mean, as you can hear from that, it just kind of makes it, it's a little bit more evil, a little bit more menacing. Helps it cut through a lot as well. It's a lot more kind of spitty. There's a lot more diction to that style of vocal as well. So on a section like this at the end of the song where it's kind of repeated over and over, it really adds a nice dynamic to it. And then at the end of the song, we've got a sample of, the guys like samples anyway. I like a sample now and again. I think this is one that John found, as some mental preacher fella. yeah, I can't remember what he was shouting about, but he's shouting about something. He's not happy about something, so we thought we'd lob him in on the end. So it's worth saying as well with that, you can kind of hear the radio interference on the background. The sample was actually a TV clip, so it sounded way better than that. What I did to that was I ran it through... Let me find it. I ran it through a Sound Toys Effect Rack preset that was called Radio Bad Connection, that's the one. So I ran it through this to get it to sound horrible. Basically all this is doing is it's a ton of different distortion and filter sort of plugins stacked up that make it sound like a crackly old radio. The problem was, if I play this track... Even when the audio is done, the plugin's so noisy that it stays on after the fact. So I put it through that and then I exported the file, dropped it back in. Hence the reason there's no plugins, and that's a region on its own. Aside from that, I think there's one little vocal trick that I want to talk about that I haven't spoke about, and that's this reverse scream here. Apologies, my computer's finally decided it's going to misbehave today. There we go, so just in isolation, this is how that sounds. So again, it just helps it, it helps the vocal lead in from the previous section. It gives it a nice kind of smooth transition. How I did that, just for anyone who's curious, because I think it's a trick that's becoming more and more prominent these days, and I think people enjoy the way it sounds. What I did was basically I took this vocal, I reversed it. I'm not going to do the whole thing now, but I reversed the vocal so it's backwards, put a reverb on this vocal so that the tails are going to the right, obviously. So this first word, when it's the right way around, it's quite a short word. If you put it the wrong way around and add a reverb tail to it, it becomes quite long. So add the reverb, export that, and what happens is when you flip it back the right way around, all these words have got reverb tails to the left now, and that reverb tail would basically be lined up like that. So all I did was I chopped it when the word came in and then moved it down to a separate channel. So all you're basically doing, if you ever want to do those type of effects, is taking a vocal, flipping it the wrong way around, adding a reverb to it and printing it there so it's there on the file, and then flipping it backwards so each word's got a reverb kind of tail running into the word. And that's how I achieve that sort of little reverse scream effect there. But as far as this session goes, I think I've touched on everything that I wanted to. I think I've touched on everything that the guys would have probably found interesting or worth talking about for the record. So I think at this point I will say goodbye. The only other thing I'll add is once the guys release this, I'll keep an eye on the comments section. So if anyone does have any questions or anyone wants to talk about anything that I've done or how I've approached something or why I've done it, I'll keep my eye on those comments and try and get back to people as and when possible. But aside from that, cheers for listening, guys. I hope it's been, if not useful, then at least interesting, so you can have a look into how the guys have put this record together. It's a brilliant record. There's some more great tracks to come pretty soon, and I hope you all enjoy them. But that's me for today. Catch you later. Bye.